Folks in Santer Hollow still say it started the night a traveler and his dog walked into an abandoned mine and set the whole town to wondering what we were made of. That traveler was me, Elias Crow, and the dog was my German Shepherd, Ranger. We weren't hunting trouble, but we stepped under that rotten timber because a steady green shimmer in the dark kept breathing like a sleeping thing. I remember telling the barkeep later, traveler and his dog in an abandoned mine, what they discovered shocked the whole town, and he slapped the bar like I was boasting. I wasn't boasting. I was trying to put the first truth in the right place so the rest would sit square. I did not aim to be anyone's hero. I was passing through, dust on my hat brim and road in my bones, looking for one quiet night where the sky stayed put. Ranger paced the portal like he'd sooner kiss a rattler than cross that threshold, then leaned his shoulder against my leg to say a man doesn't have to prove nothing to nobody. Still, I told him soft, if this is foolishness, it's my kind, and if it ain't, we'll keep our heads. The wind that slid out of that hole had a metal taste, like someone struck a penny against my tongue. The wooden braces creaked tired. Somewhere deeper in that throat of rock, a wagonette wheel ticked slow as a pocket watch forgotten in a drawer. I set my lantern going and took the first steps. Ranger's iron-clipped paws followed quiet as rain on ash. The lantern threw a buttery circle around our boots and left the edges to the green. It wasn't ghost fire so much as mineral shine, I told myself, though telling isn't believing. Air cooled my lungs to the point it felt like a church swallow had flown into my chest and gone still. A bat stitched one dark seam from wall to wall. I kept an eye on the rails. When a mine dies, you can still read its last thoughts in the iron, the way you can read a man's temper in the veins that jump at his temple. After a dozen steps, the ties underfoot changed rhythm, soft dust to hard grit, like the song had decided on a different key. Ranger stopped cold, nose cutting the air into small, careful scoops. He angled toward a fallen ledger page wedged under a rail plate. I worked it free and brushed damp off with my thumb. I couldn't read much, just half a word and a run of numbers, but the half word hit me sideways. Lease. Paper like that wasn't old, and it wasn't any tourist map. I folded it and slid it inside my duster. Behind us, the dark sat polite, waiting to see if we'd be sensible. Up ahead, the glow swelled greener, then dimmed, then swelled again till the rock looked like lungs. Folks say the mine sings. Maybe it does. That night, it hummed a steady note you could feel in the bones of your face. Ranger's lips lifted just enough to show clean teeth when the hum climbed. Not a snarl, more like a careful opinion about the company we were keeping. I told myself a miner had smeared something clever on the rock. Miner's prank, I said out loud, and Ranger cut me a look that made me add, all right, maybe not a prank. We moved slow. The lantern kissed a rusted pickaxe, a busted helmet with the brim split, and a tin coffee cup set square on a tie like somebody meant to lift it again. Everything smelled like wet pennies and old thunder. Past a bend, the roof dropped low, ribs of timber cinched tight as a corset. I ducked. Ranger flowed. The hum grew teeth, short little bites in the air. I held the lantern up and met a skein of cobwebs strung so fresh they still had wet in them. The green pooled delicate through the threads, winter moss pale. Then came a second sound, tick, 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 like a moth trapped under glass. I pressed my cheek to the wall. The tick lived inside the rock. No water, no insect. Metal talking to metal, maybe. A crooked echo of a machine. I don't love machines down in the earth. The land's a fine partner, but she doesn't like gears in her belly. Ranger nosed my wrist hard. The green rolled back like tide, surged again, and for the breath of a breath, the wall turned slick as a blank window. It remembered how to be stone before I learned what to call what I'd seen. Hold, I said, and Ranger had already wheeled to watch our rear. Nothing there but our own breath, chalk white in the lamplight. The window feeling past. Maybe the mountain just blinked to see what sort of man had walked into its mouth. We set along the left-hand wall, taking the fox path, quiet, crooked, cautious, where the rails curved to a platform with a handbrake rusted in the pulled position. A clean chalk star marked the tie beside it. New. Ranger lifted his nose, mouth shut, eyes soft as a poet's, and drifted toward a seam of cold air sneaking where the wall met the brace. I put my shoulder into the brace and felt a clever bit of carpentry slip its knot. The brace swung like a gate that had been waiting for my hand for years. Behind it, the green died down and the air learned the words still. Footprints waited in the dust. Heel sharp, toe narrow, city shoes. Ranger placed his paw beside one print, then touched his nose to my knuckles. That meant we got company. I mounted the lantern on a cut beam and took a knee. Far below, a shaft held oil-dark water calm as a blind eye. The green skated over it and turned itself into coins that never moved. On the far wall, an old hand-painted sign leaned crooked. No whistling, no talk of luck. I smiled because my grandma used to say superstition is just respect with its boots on. Ranger wagged once, small, church-safe, then stilled again, eyes on the water like it had almost spoken plain. A little cart tucked in the shadows made me ease forward. Not a miner's hand cart, but something newer, with a battery box cinched to the chassis and a stubby electric motor with dust rubbed clean away by hands that had handled it lately. I touched the motor's casing with the back of my fingers and found it warm. Somebody had been driving that rig down here. Words ain't proof, but I said them anyway, because words can be a kind of courage. Somebody's been driving in here. Ranger turned his ears into straight-up questions and then angled them down the drift. A seam no higher than my shoulder offered a sideways crawl bore into black. The hum in that seam wasn't the same as the big hum. This was a trimmed, tidy sound, a little throat song as regular as a sewing machine and too smooth to be breezed. I set my shoulder and slid in sideways, keeping the lantern ahead of my knees so the heat wouldn't make me cuss. Ranger came after, his breathing steady, his collar buckle tapping rock so faint it felt like time itself doing the counting. Dust put old history on my tongue. The bore opened into a pocket chamber, and that chamber forked into two branches, left cold, right warm. The cold branch breathed like a low door in winter. The warm branch carried smell of oil and hands. The floor had been groomed. That's the only word. Someone had broomed the crumbs aside and laid thin boards across the worst holes. The lantern found a coil of wire no miner ever owned, thin and slick, looped neat as a sermon noose. The green light held off this place like a river splits around a stone. I heard a far-off thrum, not the hum now, but a cousin higher-pitched, uncertain, like a sparrow flying circles inside a drum. Ranger set his paw on a shallow metal box half buried by a board. I pried it up with my knife and snapped the lid. Inside lay a microphone tiny as a coat button, taped beside a little battery and a wire. Not a ghost, not a toy, not for miners. "Who's listening?" I asked the dark. Ranger listened harder. We backed out and put the box back exactly as we found it. Sometimes the safest thing is leaving a warning bell where it can keep doing its job. Back at the platform, the chalk star waited patient. I set the lantern down and leaned where the rail gave me a look down the shaft again. The coins on that black water still didn't move. Above the platform, a hair-thin line, green as witchlight, ran into a crack too high for my reach and aimed itself toward the old service trail that climbs the ridge. It looked like a wire dressed up in superstition's clothes. I eased a breath out and thought of Sheriff Harlan Voss, who never liked to hurry, and of the Whitcomb place crouched on that ridge like a swan on black water, where Laurel Whitcomb kept her white dresses free of dust and her books full of numbers. I took one last slow lap of the platform, the way a rancher checks a gate twice after a mean wind. On the back of the brake post, a shaving of survey tape clung, marked with felt pen, 2 letters, 3 numbers, and a crooked arrow. It smelled faintly like citrus and fresh batteries. Ranger already had the new smell, ozone bright as a struck match. And more than the smell, the brittle feeling around the thin wire dressed up as witchlight. Someone had been testing or listening or both, and they didn't mean for a drifter and his dog to be the ones to catch them at it. Santer Hollow keeps a porch story called The Fires of Santer. Folks say the mountain lights itself when a greedy man steps wrong, and the green is miners' souls trying to be seen. I never claimed belief, only respect. Respect keeps a man from blowing a lamp where gas might sit like a shy snake, and from whistling where an old hand told him not to. Respect keeps a man's mouth shut till his boots have earned an opinion. At the Adit, we let the night pour over us like a clean creek. The Whitcomb house rode the ridge like a white swan on black water. I had seen Laurel Whitcomb once on the courthouse steps, pretty as porcelain and sharp as a draw knife, and again at the post office, where numbers seemed happy to stand still in her palm. She owned the land owned the mine. Between those two sat whatever trouble we had just put our names to. "Daybreak," I told Ranger, fastening the promise by saying it twice. "Sheriff Voss first, then a call on Miss Whitcomb. No whistling, no talk of luck." He answered with a low, chesty noise that meant he agreed to the work and the walking both. We took the switchbacks slow. Ranger hates those on account of how they make a mile wear a fancy disguise. He prefers straight truth from here to there. So he scouted a little, came back to touch my leg, then went ahead again like a soft courier, proving we were still ourselves. Down in the bowl, the town lights blinked yellow and decent. The river kept its gravel voice, and a freight far off counted miles with iron wheels. That piece didn't quite cover the mine. It sat off to the side like a chair at supper waiting for someone who ain't come yet. By the time we hit the first switchback, the glow had died to a notion, and the hum was something my bones only pretended to remember. Across the valley, the town lights blinked yellow and decent, not breathing at all. But the mine rode with me, and so did the two halves of trouble in my pocket. Whatever lived down there would not stay put. What the traveler and his dog found tonight would walk up every porch in Santer Hollow before it was done. Some folks would holler ghost, some would say grifters. I wasn't betting yet, only promising myself I wouldn't whistle or talk luck till we had the sheriff in the loop and our boots on the Whitcomb porch. I am a traveler by habit, not pride. Road dust feels like kin to me, but that mine knew my name now, and the dark had turned its face toward town. Ranger stood easy, ears forward, tail still, the kind of dog a man can trust without speeches. I rubbed the notch in his ear where an old coyote lesson lives and told him the plan plain. At daybreak, we find Sheriff Voss. Then we pay respects to Miss Laurel Whitcomb. We keep our tongues tight till we know which way the wind is lying, and we don't whistle. Ranger gave a grunt that sat halfway between a laugh and a prayer. The trail smelled of sage and cold iron. Down in the valley, a freight rolled slow and counted miles with its wheels. I touched the paper that said lease and felt the mountain breathe once more, slow as sleep, like it was listening to see if I meant what I said. Daybreak came slow and careful, and we let it. Ranger and me took the ridge road down with the kind of quiet a man wears when he's trying not to wake what he barely slipped past. The Whitcomb place stayed white behind us like a bone, the mine stayed underfoot like a held breath, and Santer Hollow spread in the bowl, roofs patched with tin and hope. I kept a hand in my duster on that folded page with the word lease, a thin, papery kind of trouble. Sheriff Harlan Voss kept his desk where a feed store used to keep its oats. He's tall beyond the needs of ceilings and shaves like he's honest, not vain. I took the chair that didn't wobble. Ranger found a square of sun and made it his. "Morning, Elias," the sheriff said. "Your dog's still smarter than you?" "By a length and a tail. We were in the mine last night." I set the paper down. Half a ledger page. Word lease, numbers, chalk star on a tie. A little cart with a warm electric motor. A wire thin as angel hair sewn into a crack running toward the ridge. And a button mic in a tin box under a board. Voss made a small tent of his brows. "Button mic," he said, like trying on a hat. "Somebody's listening to whoever listens to the mountain." I told him about the groomed floor, the blind water with coins of green that never move, and the hum in that crawl bore. Too smooth to be breeze. I kept the lonesome poetry out and left the parts that smelled like a scheme. "Laurel Whitcomb filed a notice last year," Voss said. "Might lease mineral rights. No follow-through." He tapped the paper. "This scrap gives me an address and no name. It points up your ridge," I said. "We'll be polite," he answered, already standing. "But our eyes will carry a backbone. Laurel Whitcomb's porch will fix a man's posture without asking." She stood there like a lighthouse that had chosen to be a woman. Porcelain skin, black hair pinned smooth, dressed the color of cream you save for family. Numbers seemed to sit up straight when she looked at them. "Sheriff, Mr. Crow, and Ranger," she said, and Ranger lifted one paw like he'd met her before in a kind story. Inside smelled like lemon oil and timber that refused to splinter. I laid out facts and kept the embroidery in my pocket. Laurel rolled the word lease along her tongue like tasting a path not taken. People have scratched at this land all my life, she said. Gold one year, copper the next, and now rare earths with names they pronounce like virtue. Father married this mountain. I am only keeping house, but I do not host thieves. Any visitors in the small hours? Voss asked. No one I invited. She listened to the sheriff describe the thin wire. If someone strings on my ridge, they are brave if they think I won't notice, and foolish if they think I won't cut it down. She let her gaze settle. I've had letters, no names, offers with numbers a little too friendly. Can you read the lie? I asked, and regretted the shape of it. She smiled, forgiving. Mr. Crow, I speak fluent number. She scratched Ranger's neck. He accepted with the quiet grace he reserves for people who don't waste words. We'll want you at the Adit at dusk, Voss said. We'll walk it in daylight and measure what sings at night. You'll have me, she said, making it a pledge, not a favor. May Sinclair opens her place before noon because she likes light on her bottles. She's beautiful in a red way, mouth lacquered, hair pinned in a hurry that still turns heads, dressed the color of good cherries. She says she hears the mine sing at 3. Elias, she purred, Sheriff, Miss Whitcomb, and the gentleman whose opinion matters. She meant Ranger. He blinked slow, his version of tipping a hat without making change. We're not here for drinks, Voss said. Then you'll leave thirsty. She leaned on the bar. Ask. I'm seeking a wire with a voice, I said. Hides in cracks, runs to the ridge. May's lip did a thinking curl. You think I said it? Honey, I string beads when I'm bored, not mountains. She looked through the front window as if the hill could press its ear to her glass. The hum comes at 3, not 2:59, not 3:01. 3, clean as a pew. Clean numbers make dirty alibis, Laurel said, polite as a blade. Seen trucks on the service trail? Sometimes, May answered. Tires on shale while I'm counting tips. I think that's none of my business. And then the green shows in the window like a breath held by a giant, and I remember I do like a story that pays and a story that sings. Who drives? Voss asked. Hard to see, she said. Might be Silas Pike. Might be somebody with city heels. She glanced down. Mirrors, too. I've seen light catch wrong when men tote glass like they're moving saints. We left May with her bottles listening today. The Adit mouth exhaled when we reached it near sundown. Laurel surprised me in trousers under her riding skirt, the kind of choice that says a person plans to look like a painting and move like a plan. May came as far as the second timber, where she hung a charm and told it to mind us like a polite superstition. Voss brought rope and a careful face. I brought oil and stubbornness. The green lay thin as fish skin. Ranger stepped where I stepped until he didn't, and angled his head at a wall that had been plain as bread that morning. Now it wore a blush like struck match. When I breathed on the dust, it glowed and went out. UV powder, Laurel said. Children use it for parties. Men use it for lies. No children, I said. She nodded once. Of course not in my story. We went fox quiet past the chalk star to the platform and the blind water. The coins in that black eye hadn't moved, but 2 more waited that hadn't been there. Slivers of mirror far across the drift trimmed our lantern into tricks. We cut the wire, Voss said, lifting the coil. Cut it wrong and we tell whoever's listening exactly when we learned, I said. Let's be lonely one more night. Laurel ran her fingers along the brace we'd swung before and stopped at a fresh notch. Ranger locked on the crawl bore. The hum inside had chosen a key. I could feel it in my teeth. Back at the second timber, May called down the drift, voice like a bell wrapped in velvet. 255! We held our ground and let the dark ripen. I snuffed the lantern. The green opened its sleepy eye and washed the stone like moon milk. 3 came in smooth enough to shave on. The hum ran along the wire, sat in the water, climbed the brace, touched the coins, and found the mirrors. Behind it, a small generator cleared its throat. Ranger let a sound out his nose, the one that says he agrees to my plan and reminds me to agree to his patience. I nicked the thin wire where it bent into a crack. just enough to make a listening ear doubt itself. With my palm flat to rock, I felt a second beat below the show. Steady, small, like a fence post talking in its sleep. Micro-tremor. Someone teaching the mountain to take a pulse so they can know where she will give. Mapping, Laurel said into the dark, voice clean as fresh china. They are mapping stress on my ridge. 301, May called, delighted by the curtain drop even when she knows who is backstage. The hum cut. The mirrors remembered how to be glass. The green tired out. We breathed, and the mountain breathed back. Now we cut, Voss said, rope quiet on his shoulder. Now we cut, I agreed. At dawn. Then we'll visit the P.O. box that thinks it owns Santer Hollow. We stepped into night that hadn't noticed the noise under its skin. Laurel's porch found us again, cool, white, sure. May kissed her charm and declared us handsome enough to be spared. Voss looked taller under the stars, which is no small trick. Ranger leaned on my leg once, then tasted the wind for morning. On our way out of May's, we cut down Furnace Street where the dirt remembers wagons. A man can learn a town by the way it looks away from its own courthouse. Santer Hollow looks away with cracked paint that someone still believes can be mended. Outside the hardware, I saw Silas Pike pick purple powder from the cradle of his thumb with a pocket knife dull enough to be polite. You hunting saints or sinners, Silas? I asked. Depends who pays, he said. Up close, his face looked carved by long evenings underground. Fluorite made narrow violets in the hinge of each finger. You smelled a generator, he said without me saying it. You heard glass pretending to be angels? You've seen faces? Voss asked. Only the kind that shine when they shouldn't, Silas said. Suits that don't scuff and boots that don't creak. They move like folks who know a door will open because they bought the hinge. He flicked the powder away. Careful, traveler. A mountain will forgive a shovel before she forgives a ledger. Laurel tipped her chin like she'd filed that beside important sentences. If you know a name, Mr. Pike, you can earn more than powder at my door. I know a truck, he said. Flatbed with a tarp trained to lie. I know the sound of a two-cylinder set tuned by somebody who don't sleep. And I know mirrors, slivers the size of shingle. Catch a lamp with those, and a poor boy will have visions he'll never admit were only glass. Ranger sniffed his cuff and offered the man a spare dignity. Silas nodded like equals, then told us where he'd heard tires on shale last. A switchback below the service trail, where a cedar grows like a question mark out of a scar of rock. Voss sketched it on the back of a summons. Laurel watched his pencil like it were a plow cutting straight rows. We split to ready what needed readying. Voss fetched a bolt cutter and a voice recorder he trusts more than his memory. Laurel closed 2 backroom shutters with a firmness that chose which eyes got to look in. I bought lamp oil and a coil of wire of my own, the honest kind, for reasons I couldn't name yet. Ranger drank at the trough, then looked at me as if asking, "Are we hunting or are we tending?" "Both," I told him. He sneezed agreement. Dusk tilted the bowl of the valley. Crickets tuned up in the sage. Lightning far off counted in a language dry country speaks when it misses rain but won't beg. Back at the adit, we checked sign-like hands reading Braille. The chalk star hadn't learned new tricks, but the wire dressed in witch light had a fresh kink, the kind made when a man folds in a hurry, then forgets the fold stays. Ranger set his forepaws square by it and waited for my say-so. You ever listen to a mountain and feel it listening back? I asked Laurel while we waited for 3. All my life, she said, holding the adit mouth the way a steady rider holds a colt, firm and kind. The mountain has rules. Men misname them luck. Ranger leaned into my leg. The hum, when it found its pitch, came from a place you can't point to with a finger, only with your jaw. We let the green have its theater, and in letting it learn the rhythm of whoever wrote the script, on at 3, off at 3:01, tidy as a clerk. A person that exact will leave a trail exact enough to trip on. When the dark set back to normal, we let our breath come the size of our chests again. Voss touched the wire and made it say a tiny S. Dawn, he said. We make a polite cut. Then we see which way the fish runs. Ranger and me will take the service trail blind to start, I said. Smell first, look second. Laurel's half smile said the plan matched the ridge. We walked out under a sky full of faithful stars. The Whitcomb place waited on its hill like an answer you don't say yet. Down in town, May's window kept the kind of light that says, "Come if you must. Leave if you're smart." Ranger stopped once to listen to nothing, which in his language means something. He looked left, nose high, then dropped it and wrote patience on the dust with his tail. "Tomorrow," I told the ridge, the wire, the P.O. box, the tidy suit, and the ledger that cuts meaner than any pick. "Tomorrow we learn who's mapping whose bones." Ranger gave one bark, quiet as a promise. Before we broke, Voss put his big hand on my shoulder in a way that looked like rest and felt like warning. "Elias," he said, "if this turns out to be men with papers instead of men with guns, the shooting just moves to a different room. Keep your boots legal." I promised him I would try. Ranger bumped my knee, which is his way of seconding motions, and Laurel lifted her chin to the ridge the way a woman lifts a lantern. Not to be seen, but to see. We slept light, boots waiting by the door. Dawn eased under the door and sat quiet. We met it at the mine mouth where timbers keep score on every man who ducks. Sheriff Harlan Voss carried bolt cutters big enough to argue. I had a spool of honest wire and a pocket knife that knows when to be patient, and Laurel Whitcomb wore trousers under her riding skirt again, which made the morning look serious. May stopped at the second timber and hung her red charm. Ranger leaned into my shin, ready. "Once I nip this hair," Voss said, touching the witchlight line with 2 fingers, "whoever's on the other end will hear a missing note. Then we learn how they sing when somebody bumps the piano," I answered. We didn't cut at the first bend. We followed the line into a crack and on to where old boards remember boots. The blind water kept its green coins. We found a tie dusted with powder glow where a man had wiped his hands. Voss squeezed the cutters, slow and steady. The wire made a soft, surprised gasp I felt in my teeth. Ranger's ears stood hard, then softened to the angle that means wait and see. We waited. No alarm, no boot chorus. Just the mind deciding to keep our secret 1 minute longer. "Walk it up the ridge," I said. "If the tail's yanked, the head might scratch." Laurel nodded like a woman who understands animals and men in that order. We backed out, let daylight wash us clean, and took the service trail that zigzags through cedar and shale till it thinks better of you. The switchback where Silas said tires chewed shale wore fresh scrapes. Ranger dropped his nose and stitched scent into a tidy blanket. Oil, cinnamon cleaner, a whisper of perfume, no wind has any business carrying at dawn. He led us to the cedar that grows like a question mark. Behind that tree, the path split the way only locals know. We took the small way, narrow and quick. Half a mile up, we found a nest of wires and glass, suitcase generator under tarp, a slim mast with mirrors, tape marks listing angles. Tidy mischief. Laurel traced Euro 3 do 0 printed too neat for miners. "At 3, the mirror choir sings back to the adit," she said. Voss lifted the tarp. "Battery bank and a seismograph," he said, tapping a twitchy needle. "They're taking the mountain's pulse." Ranger kept his nose to a cable that ran off the mast into scrub. He followed it past a circle of rock where someone had snubbed a rope, then down to a slot half covered with cedar duff. I cleared it with my heel and found a conduit dressed as root. The cable ducked into that root and headed toward the ridge road and whatever waited with a P.O. box and a suit. "Cut here?" Voss asked. "Not yet," I said. "Meet the brain before you insult the nerves." Laurel's mouth did that half smile again. We left the generator asleep and took the small way back till it forgot we were ever there. From the ridge road, we saw the post office by the courthouse. We tracked the conduit where it surfaced, then slipped under the road to a patch of scabby gravel. Ranger pawed twice and stepped aside. Underneath sat a weatherproof box with a city lock. "Valley View," Laurel read off a sticker. "That's a pretty name to hang on someone else's bones." Voss pried the lid. Inside, a radio, tidy timers, a lithium brick. The antenna cable ran to another patch down the road, likely stepping Fox straight toward town. Laurel checked the serial labels. "Leased," she said. "Not bought. Borrowed name." She took a number picture with a small book she kept in her head. I could almost see the sum climbing. "Judge by noon?" I asked. "He believes in my neck," Voss said. "He'll sign." He looked at Ranger. Boy, you ever wear a deputy star? Ranger wagged once. That was oath enough for me. We split. Laurel to gather paper of her own. Voss to sweet-talk a judge. Me and Ranger to learn what a P.O. box looks like when it's nervous. The post office smells like gum glue, envelopes, dust, and small money. Mrs. Peak ran the counter with a mouth that likes the middle of words and eyes that catch the edges. She knows who owes which stamp and who whistles on the way out. "Morning, Elias," she said. "Your dog brings better manners than most men." "He's the brains," I said. "Tell me about a box that pays cash and collects at odd hours." "Wouldn't be decent," she said, then reconsidered. If a box were like that, it'd belong to a company with a pretty name and no cousins. A city jacket comes after supper, smells like elevators, asks for mail in a voice that makes air temporary. Does he sign? Never. Leaves a postcard to himself in case a parcel lands. No forwarding, no phone. Polite as an envelope and just as empty. She tipped her chin toward the brass. Try the row that sticks. Ranger found a chewed brass door that yielded at last. Cinnamon cleaner again. Inside, a blank postcard. Valley View. "Appreciate you," I said. She slid a scrap. 2:30, parcel, Valley View, ask for ledger. Ranger clicked the tile twice. We told Voss, he told the judge. Laurel told her numbers to sit up. May saved a bottle for later. "For your victory lap or your bandage," she said. At 2:20, a man arrived in a dustless suit, new boots, sharp heel, briefcase. He jiggled the sticky box, then came to the counter and pressed 2 fingers to the case like checking its pulse. "Parcel for Valley View Lighting," he said, like he'd never met dark. "Ledger?" Mrs. Peak asked. He chose surprise. "Why would I require that?" She made him sign anyway, initials careful enough to pick a lock. I read the letters upside down. E.T. He tucked the parcel under his arm. When he turned, he met Laurel coming in. She took in his suit the way water takes a stone. "Afternoon," she said. "Ma'am," he answered, and set a hat he hadn't worn onto his head like it belonged. He walked out past me and Ranger, who put his muzzle by the parcel and took a thoughtful whiff. The man hid his flinch like a magician palms a coin. We let him make the first mistake. I followed close. E.T. took a quiet truck with a rental plate. Voss stepped out of a doorway he'd been leaning on and let the badge flash like thunder without sound. "Afternoon," he said. "Got a minute to talk about your lighting?" E.T. smiled like a tax form and tried to let the smile do the thinking. "We provide rural improvements," he said. "Lighting, mapping, modern conveniences." "Mapping," Laurel repeated, though she hadn't been invited. "Of other people's bones." "Your concerns are noted," he answered, turning civilian words into legal smoke. "Warrant to inspect nodes on county and private land," Voss read. E.T. cracked the parcel. Timers, a coil of wire, and a lease draft with Laurel typed, but not signed. The half ledger in my pocket matched the draft clean. Laurel didn't color, but the air seemed to tilt her way. "You must be the traveler," E.T. said. "And the dog," Ranger yawned. "Local stakeholders will benefit." "Stakeholders means somebody else drives your wagon," I said. "Sheriff, do what you need. I'll call my office." He lifted a phone, walked 2 steps like he owned the signal, watched it blink and give up, then blamed the sky. "Funny thing about Sanner Hollow," I said. "You can borrow our view. It won't borrow you back." We took the parcel, the node map tucked in the lid, and the man's time. Voss sat deputies on the nodes while we walked the ridge again. Ranger trotted ahead, pleased our feet finally agreed with our noses. Up at the nest, we logged serials and took pictures. Silas met us halfway with news. A second truck took the east spur to the old ore mill. We made for the mill. Heat hung on. Weeds argued. Fresh treads led to a door on one hinge. Inside, shade bent the green into slivers and whispers. A second stage waited. Mirror frame, second timer, chalk schedule, crates labeled with initials that could mean a woman I knew or a company I didn't. I lifted a lid. A ledger waited. Names to letters, cash tallies, a hand that wouldn't smudge. I shut it again. Ranger set his paws on the crate and gave me the foreman look. Silas rubbed violet dust off his fingers. "They wanted the town stung by ghosts long enough to lease cheap," he said. "You scare a man off his own fence, he'll thank you for selling him a shorter yard. He glanced toward Laurel like he expected steel and got porcelain instead. She gave him coins for truth and caution. "Bring me a name when your ears find one," she said. "Not a rumor. A name that will stand up in daylight." Silas nodded, and his boots said he was already walking toward it. Voss walked a slow circle, measuring next moves. "We could shut it all now," he said, "and they'd swear it was a storm. Or we can leave it breathing, set watchers on each box and mast, and catch the hands that feed the thing." He looked to me, which is a sheriff's way of testing if a traveler plans to stay. "I can sit hard," I said. "Ranger likes work that requires a nose." Laurel tapped the ledger once like a judge taps a rail. "We'll do both," she said. "We'll cut their ear up canyon and leave their mouth down here. At 3 they will try to speak, and we will hear who they are when the sound doesn't carry." We laid a plan plain enough for tired people to remember. Deputy Hale would sit the box. Deputy Jimenez the second patch. Voss and me would hold the ridge nest. Laurel would watch the service trail. May would listen. Silas would prowl the ore road. Ranger memorized the smells. Parcel man, lithium, cinnamon cleaner, money cologne filed under his ribs. On our way down, an owl brushed my ear. We set small cairns to tell if a boot passed and chalked a dust-colored mark only an old hand would see. Voss sent a note to the judge by a boy on a bicycle. Near sundown, Ranger found a fresh scuff under the question mark cedar. Heat the sun hadn't earned still lived there. The walker carried weight on the right. Ranger wanted the chase. I told him we were fishing, not hunting. He sighed and forgave me. Back in town, we traded words like tools. Mrs. Peak would ring 2 bursts if our city friend returned, 3 if he brought a friend. May set a mirror to catch the door. Laurel locked her books, lit a kitchen lantern, cooked eggs for folks not hungry. I watered Ranger. When he'd had enough, he looked at the hill. His clock was set for 3. Mine runs off his. As dusk burned down to coal, we returned to the adit and took our places like pieces on a board. Voss settled behind a timber with a notebook and a patience you could sit on. Laurel chose a rock that framed the service trail. She tied her hair tighter, which is how some folks load another round of focus. May stayed at her window. The red there said she was keeping time with us. I laid my duster on a beam so Ranger's belly wouldn't drink up the cold. The air had its metal taste. Rails ticked now and then like a house remembering a step. The nicked wire lay quiet, the cut so clean a spider might have spun on it. We spoke with hands and small nods. At 2:40, a shape came down the trail, kept to brush, and paused by the question mark cedar. He waited, counting the same numbers we were, then turned back uphill as if a clock in another county had struck wrong. Ranger held the air he left and set his jaw, the limp we'd almost chased. "Tomorrow," I mouthed. Ranger rolled one ear and let the night keep its sentence. Tonight we'd sit close to the adit and count down to 3 the way you count lightning when you can't afford thunder. Night waited the way a horse waits at a gate. The town didn't know yet, but the traveler and his dog had found a hinge, and Santer Hollow's front door had started to move. We held the adit like a breath. 2:50, 2:55. Stone cooled the idea of time until only counting was left. Laurel took her place where a slice of the service trail framed in rock. Her cream blouse under the riding coat made a pale flag in the seam dark. Sheriff Voss had his notebook, and that long silence of his that makes men say too much. May watched from the mouth with a mirror angled the way only a barkeep knows to angle a secret. Ranger lay with his chin on my boot and listened with his whole skin. At 2:58, the nicked wire woke and tried to sing past its throat. At 2:59, the mirror's upridge trembled, then steadied. Voss tapped once on the timber. May's mirror lifted a hair. Laurel's breath shrank. Ranger's ear rolled up and locked. 3 o'clock stepped into the mine like a man who owns the deed. The hum came on exact, even with our cut like a hiccup inside it. It ran down the hairline wire, touched the blind water, slid into the mirrors, and told the green to open its sleepy eye. The coffined pick and the busted helmet remembered their shapes. Somewhere beyond sight, a small generator coughed, polite, less loud than last night. Our snip had made the throat sore. I set my palm to rock and felt the deeper beat, micro tremors the mountain makes when she settles her skirts. Whoever set this choir was listening to that beat, teaching the ridge to confess where it would give. Ranger pressed his paw on my toes. That meant company. The limp from last night drifted into view, a dark postage stamp on the trail. He paused by the question mark cedar, checked his watch with his whole shoulder like men do when they're borrowing a habit, then took the small way we'd taken at dawn. Laurel tipped her chin. Voss's thumb found his holster clip and stopped there. I stayed storyteller still. The green bled along a seam we'd missed and found a low door painted to look like rock. Its side open, like it had been waiting to join the rumor. A second figure slipped through. No limp. City heel trying to be ranch heel. The two men met beyond the brace we'd swung that first night. Voices carried like moths, all paper and dust. "Cut on the lower line," City heel said. "Returns dirty. We need the map clean." "Lower line was fine before you made it fancy," Limp said. "No one used to measure ghosts with a pocket watch." "Stakeholders," City heel answered. "A word that don't belong underground. They want a model that renders. We let them work. Sometimes a thief writes his own name if you hand him a pencil." The limp crawled into the side bore Ranger hates. City heel took a mirror sliver and a coil, talking to the dark like it owed him a receipt. The hum shaved itself tidier, then faltered at our nick. City heel frowned the way men frown when a thing they bought won't fetch. A click like a coin on porcelain came from behind the door. "Battery," Limp muttered. "Pack B," City heel said. The hum tried a new route and hit our nick like a sore tooth. The coins on the black water rippled, though there's no breeze there. Ranger lifted his head a finger's worth and set it down again. That means we're at the part of the story where one needless move turns heroes into names on a granite slab. "Now," Laurel breathed, and the mountain sounded like it agreed. Voss stepped into light that isn't badge a simple moon. "Santer County Sheriff," he said. "Gentlemen, you're fixing to wish your permits were bigger than your nerve." City heel turned guilty before his face remembered training. Limp looked at Laurel the way men look at weather, helpless, hopeful, mad at sky. "We got paper," City heel said. "Stakeholder consent." "Laurel Whitcomb," Laurel said, and the mine knew her name. "Consent happens with my hand on the ink. It's only mapping." Limp tried, voice soft. "No harm. We sing once a night and leave no footprints. The green is theater to keep folks clear. People want a story. They'll get one," I said, "and it includes your employer's name." City heel reached for the coil. Voss set his boot on it, polite as Sunday, shook his head once. Limp measured Ranger and found a deacon where he'd hoped for a fool. Then the ridge rolled in her sleep. Dust ticked from the ribs above the door. Laurel's eyes went to the timber like riders' eyes go to a colt's ear. "Out," she said, neat as a folded napkin. "Now." We backed toward the platform, hands light. City heel tried to snatch the mirror frame. The frame chose the floor and broke like old ice. The green washed into the blind water and came up different, not breath but bruised. Limp shouldered the brace into a notch with the back of his knife. Decent instinct. "Pack B off," he yelled. Gear didn't listen. Sometimes noise thinks it's boss. Ranger stood between Laurel and everything else. I wanted to apologize for putting him there. He made the face that says, "Don't." He's a working soul, and this was a work day. A cough of rock came down, pebbles and powdered lime. No blood, just gravity reminding us who is sheriff when badges forget their size. The hum cut like a snuffed candle. Silence strutted in, proud and then embarrassed. When dust sat again, we looked like miners without pay. Gray eyebrows, gray teeth, gray dog who didn't know he was gray because he was busy being brave. May swore gentle at the mouth. Laurel's cream stayed cream, which is a trick only certain women and clean conscience can do. City heel coughed numbers into his sleeve. Limp picked a side to lean on and decided not to lie for 1 full minute. "Sheriff," Limp said, "I set and fetch. Boss is a voice on a phone. Card says Valley View. That's my full confession." "No cards," City heel snapped. Council can learn Ridge the way we learned it," Laurel said. "With hands and feet." Voss took their radios and phones. One message said, "Nodes 14, okay, Echo on node 2, spectrum clean, 03 do row 03 do 1. The sort of note a man writes to a calendar he mistook for a god. Ranger sniffed the phone. Cheap suit glue, cinnamon cleaner, hotel lobby, elevator ghost. He sneezed and looked at the adit as if to say, "Give the mountain back her voice." "Why mirror?" I asked, limp, in the voice you use with skittish colts. "Why not lamp and be done?" "Because a mirror sings back the sighs you send and stretches the rest," he said. "Scare a man right, and he'll swear he saw a ghost stand still." He looked ashamed of knowing that well. "They mean to make you sell quiet," I said, "and sell cheap." Voss nodded. "We'll send the guts to a friend in Pinnacle County who can pull numbers out of numbers. Meanwhile, we want hands. Name the buyer and you walk out without a mirror stuck to your heel." "E.T. is nobody," Limp said. "He's a fairy. The buyer has a letter W. That's what the crate said at the mill. We set watchers at the pullout, the lower box and the ore road. May took her bell. Laurel and I checked the mill. Ranger approved. At the mill, Laurel found a crate stenciled W. Inside were mirror slivers, UV powder, thin wire, and a ledger marked Lee's. Whitcomb, tentative. She stared, then remembered the ink wasn't hers. Voss came with Limp and City Heel in tow. He read the stamp on a desk, Valley View, and didn't bother shrugging. "We'll need a mouth we can subpoena," he said. "A signer who sleeps while a mountain gets bruised for his calendar." "Tomorrow," Laurel said. "We ride to Pinnacle with a clean dress and my dirtiest numbers." "That leaves tonight," I said. "Tonight we sit where the flatbed must go and let the driver tell us what he's carrying because his shocks will give him away." Ranger approved with a blink the speed of a prayer. After dark, a flatbed groaned onto the service trail. Voss's badge spoke. "Permit?" The driver tried elevator talk. Ranger set paws on the running board and looked in. The man finally said the name Westray & Co., and the night had a proper noun at last. We let him turn around on condition the load stayed. Mirrors, wire, timer, same as the others, and a neat folder with a letterhead that had room for a signature and the arrogance to leave it blank. Laurel tucked the folder under her arm like a book she intended to read to the end, even if the hero died. Ranger licked my hand once, quick, which means we are still inside the story. Before we lay down, we wrote our names under our chores. Voss would sit the evidence locker like a bulldog made of paper and iron. Laurel would draft a statement that sounded half him, half ledger. May promised to keep ears on late voices and early lies. Silas would look for a cousin who once hauled for Westray & Co. and quit when his conscience learned to speak. I sharpened my pocket knife on May's back step. Steel that bites clean keeps a man from saying a messy word in front of a lady. Laurel stood on her porch after the rest of us drifted. "Mr. Crow," she said, not loud, "when men bring new words for old hunger, they count on neighbors forgetting how to sing together." "I only carry a tune if Ranger starts it," I said. "He already has." She looked at the notch in his ear like it was a key. 3 o'clock taught me this. The mountain will testify if you ask in her language. She lifted the folder. "Tomorrow I will speak mountain in a judge's room." Ranger nosed her hand with the care he saves for folks who do hard things without noise. She smiled small. "Thank you, Ranger. And you, traveler." Santer Hollow slept like it was finally allowed. Even the dogs didn't argue with moonlight. In May's spare room, I let my bones count to 3 and didn't hear a hum answer back. Ranger curled where he could see door and window both and made the soft woof that means if something tries a hinge, he intends to be there first. Near midnight, Mrs. Peak sent one burst from her little bell, our signal for curiosity, not danger. "City Heel took a room," Voss told me in the street, badge in one hand, shirt in the other. "Registered as Everett Thomas. Asked if the diner opens by 5. "Let him eat," May said from a doorway, scarf bright as cherries. "Men on empty stomachs tell thin lies." We split one more chore. I'd walk the ridge before dawn to see if any new print tried to learn the road in the dark. Laurel would sleep 3 hours and then polish truth till even a sleepy judge had to squint. Voss would draft warrants shaped like the holes we'd measured in the hill. Ranger and me took the sage path. The cedar that grows like a question mark wore a fresh scuff where a right foot drag would plant. Ranger sniffed, sneezed, and set his paw on it, his way of underlining. I stacked 3 stones where moonlight could see, and we eased back by a different line so our smell didn't draw a map for strangers. By first light, the plan smelled ironed. Deputies braided their notes. May buttered bread for men who pretend they don't need breakfast. Mrs. Peak wrote a time and 3 initials and put the slip where it would drop into the sheriff's hand without fuss. Laurel came down with her hair pinned tighter and a dress that wouldn't apologize for the road. Ranger paused at her boot and gave one serious wag. She returned a smaller one. Dignity is addressed some mornings. If you ask me why this part matters, I'll say it plain. We took the hum away and the hour stayed. The mountain kept her time without anybody else's clock. The traveler and his dog were still in it. Not heroes, just neighbors with ears. Tomorrow would be dust, paper, and a judge. Tonight, we had faithful stars and a ridge that, for once, slept like a living thing instead of a ledger. I scratched Ranger's chest, felt the drum of a dog who trusts the road. A rooster tested the dark once. Morning was coming, and we were pointed at it. Sun woke the valley like it had been polishing all night, and finally felt finished. We rolled with it. Laurel tied her hair tighter than law and wore a dress the color of milk with a riding coat that didn't mind dust. Sheriff Voss carried warrants that still smelled like fresh ink, and May slid a thermos into my hand with a face that said, "Don't argue." Ranger trotted high and easy, as if he'd already sniffed the verdict and approved the seasoning. Pinnacle County sits one ridge over and acts like its courthouse invented daylight. The judge there, Parker Sims, has eyebrows that can overrule a man without words and a pocket watch he winds when he's bored. We walked in plain, not proud. Laurel set our folder on the rail. Mirror chips, thin wire, a sliver of UV powder sealed in a glass vial, phone messages that talk in numbers like their prayer, and the lease draft with Whitcomb typed where no hand of hers had ever signed. I set the button microphone on top the pile so it could listen to its own end. "Sheriff Voss," Judge Sims said, "what kind of instrument are we discussing?" "The kind that makes neighbors into suspects and the ground into a trick," Voss answered. "They call it mapping and lighting. It's scaring folks off a ridge till the price cools to what a suit can stand." "Name the suit," the judge said. "Westray and Company," Laurel answered. The name left a mark on the wood. A messenger calling himself Everett Thomas fetched parcels from our post and placed timed nodes on my land without consent. The judge touched the lease draft with one finger, the way a man checks if a snake is rubber. "You, Miss Whitcomb, intend to sell?" "I intend to live upright," she said. "That sometimes looks like selling and sometimes looks like saying no. Nobody gets to forge my maybe into a yes." "Bring in Mr. Thomas," the judge told the bailiff. E.T. came in neat as a ledger line, chin shaved like truth hurts. He tried to pour city into the room and found there was no cup. "Valley View Lighting is engaged to survey public safety," he said. "The green that appears is incidental fluorescence. The hum is a byproduct of lawful instruments." "Lawful under whose paper?" I asked. "Santer Hollows, or a pamphlet you wrote to yourself?" Judge Sims lifted a palm. "Mr. Thomas, this court enjoys daylight. Indicate permits." E.T. laid down copies that looked like they'd never met dirt. Laurel tapped the corner, eyes kind and cold. "Those identify parcels west of the Ore Road. Mine sits east. Your nodes keep wandering." "An honest mistake," he said. "Your honest mistakes carry wire," Voss told him. "They carry mirrors. They carry powder meant to turn superstition into labor." The judge looked at the vial, then at Ranger. Ranger blinked once with the patience of a man who has heard speeches about fence lines all his life. "Show me," Judge Sims said. "Courts are for talking, but I prefer seeing." So we did what a dry county does when a storm needs proof. We took it outside. The bailiff, the clerk, E.T., and his clean boots. Laurel like a white flag at the edge of battle. Voss and his cutters, me and Ranger with our noses set to work. We drove to the ore mill where the second nest waited. I set a mirror shard in a wooden frame, ran the thin wire up a seam, pinched the powder between 2 coins, and set the button mic in a shallow tin box beneath a board just like the one we'd found. E.T. watched as if memorizing how to deny what his eyes were learning. 3 o'clock, Laurel said, not because the hour had come, but because it ruled the trick. I didn't have to wait. I put the generator into a cough and the mirror choir did the rest. Dust lit up green like breath on frozen glass. The coins became sleeping eyes. The hum quickened the bones of a man's face. The clerk grabbed the rail. Judge Sims did not. He simply leaned close enough to smell the lie. "Turn it off," he said. When the hum died, the mine remembered how to be quiet. In that quiet, the judge made his orders. "Sheriff Voss, you will seize all devices bearing serial numbers registered to Westray and Company, Valley View Lighting, and any entity their paper can be found kissing. Miss Whitcomb, your refusal to sign shall be recorded as pre-existing. Mr. Thomas, do not leave the county without this court's permission." The watch in his vest clicked once. "Also, I will sign a temporary injunction against any further placement of instruments on the Whitcomb Ridge." E.T. swallowed a legal word and set it aside. "Your Honor, stakeholders, our neighbors," the judge said. "And neighbors can read." He looked to me, which surprised me. "Mr. Crow," he said, "you are not a deputy, but you appear to be a witness. Keep a clean notebook and a cleaner tongue." "Yes, sir," I said. Ranger wagged once, our oath. Laurel thanked the judge in a way that made the room straighten itself. Outside, the light went honest again. Voss signed for custody of the seized gear. E.T. asked for a call, and the bailiff supervised his cord. On the line, he used a voice that wanted to be steel and came out tin. I caught one word in the drift: Westray. "Ever meet the man?" I asked him. "Corporate entities are people," he said, which earned him laughter even from the clerk. That's when his confidence cracked. A crack will tell you more than a speech if you listen patient. We came back over the ridge with a court behind us instead of a rumor. The plan changed shape without losing its bones. Voss kept the lockers and posted deputies. Laurel unlocked a room with ledgers thick as fence posts and began tying dates to tire tracks and notes to nights. I wrote in a plain hand everything my nose remembered and everything Ranger told me with his ears. May kept coffee like a drumbeat. Mrs. Peak laid an envelope on the counter marked ET 310 East Spur. Silas stepped out of shade on Furnace Street and said he'd found the cousin who left Westray & Co. "Cousin's name is Jess Westray," he said, which made silence lean in. "He swears the company is 3 brothers and a bank. The eldest signs W. He hates dirt, loves numbers, and keeps his boots in his office so secretaries can smell the leather and say yes." Laurel snorted, soft and elegant. "I prefer my boots to walk." She took a name from Silas without paying him in anything but respect, which for some men is richer than coin. By afternoon, we knew the East Spur led to a lay-down yard behind the county shed. Ranger found the path by pure disdain for the lie. We eased through willow and junk to a clearing where somebody had been stacking mirror frames under tarps like winter hay. A folder sat on a crate waiting for a hand that hadn't come. I opened it and learned the trick they hadn't got around to, a field test where the hum would ramp a whole minute, 3 to 3:01, and the mirrors would ladder up a seam high enough to make a figure taller than men remember themselves to be. "File with the judge," Voss said, "but we can use it too." Laurel looked at me like she'd just heard that same thought in my head. "Demonstration tonight," she said. "Only this time the town watches for itself, and the show ends with a hand we can cuff." We brought in who needed bringing: ranchers, mill hands, the preacher who keeps his sermons close to the ground, the quilting club that runs the bake sale and the ballot box, the mechanic who knows every truck by a rattle in 3rd gear. Nobody brought children. Santer Hollow knows the difference between spooky and stupid. May hung lamps on her porch as if lighting a stage. Mrs. Peak taped a sign on the post office that said, "Closed for seeing." The sun stepped down its ladder. At the adit, we set the frame and the wire and left our nick so the hum would catch and clear its throat. We rigged a second line to a box Voss could kill from his hand. Laurel stood where her people could measure her against the ridge. She looked every inch of a woman the mountain might choose if mountains made queens. Ranger walked the crowd, touching knees, taking names by smell, giving silent comfort where old miners had too many ghosts in their pockets. 3 o'clock came like a rehearsed sin. The mirrors climbed the green up the wall and made a tall, still figure where there was only rock. The hum vibrated fillings. The blind water turned into coins a fool might throw to buy his wish free. Folks muttered, then hushed, then listened the way you listen when truth puts on a coat that looks like a lie. Voss lifted his hand and pinched the line dead. The green sighed out. The figure ungrew. The water remembered it was one piece. "Neighbors," he said, voice quiet enough to earn attention. "This is a man's trick. It's meant to buy your fear and sell your land by turning your stories against you. He held up the vial, the wire, the mirror. We caught their hands. Tomorrow we'll catch the pocket those hands belong to. May let out a whoop small enough to be manners. The preacher nodded like his amen had practical boots. A rancher wiped his eyes and blamed the dust. Old miners folded their arms and looked taller. I watched the crowd learn to keep its own hour. That's when E.T. tried to take his minute back. He had slipped in at the edge and was talking into a phone that didn't have any bars this side of the ridge. Habit can be louder than facts. He saw the show die and decided to fetch the box we'd set as bait. Ranger blocked him with a quiet body. E.T. stepped left. Ranger stepped left. E.T. tried the right with a little patience. Ranger matched that grace with his own and waited until the man looked down. Then he put a paw on the case and looked at me. That meant, open it. I did. Inside sat a fresh timer printed with an install tag for a place nobody had permitted. Also a memo. W will attend personally if locals persist. Clean your angles. No improvisation. I held the memo up so the moon could read it, and so could May. Westray himself? She said, red grin sharp. I should wash a glass. Laurel took the memo like a ribbon she intended to tie to somebody's wrist. Neighbors, she said, I asked you here not to scare you, but to give you back what was being rented out from under you. Your own good sense. Tomorrow we bear witness in daylight. Tonight we go home knowing the mountain's voice is older than any pocket watch. Her words put shoulders into better places. After the crowd thinned, Voss posted 2 deputies and took E.T. in without cuffs. You're not dangerous enough for jewelry, he said. Be grateful. E.T. opened his mouth to argue and chose quiet instead. Good choice. Jail has a gravity men underestimate. My bones wanted a cot, but Ranger wanted the ridge. He walked to the question mark cedar and stood there like a man in church who hasn't found his hymn yet. I followed. The path smelled of right foot drag and hotel soap, and under it, a shy new thread. Printer ink, fresh and cheap. Somebody had just made copies in a place with a humming table and a rented plant. I told Voss. He put Jimenez on the business parks west of Pinnacle. Find me the office that looks temporary, he said. Ranger wagged with the satisfaction of a tool that knows its use. Laurel stood beside me and watched the hill breathe. Her dress kept its cream, and the night agreed to keep it that way. The town didn't flinch, she said, like she hadn't been the spine of it. That helps. She touched the notch in Ranger's ear. You're a brave soul, sir. He accepted the promotion. We walked back slow, carrying quiet the way you carry a pail that's near full. Steady, no show. Santer Hollow had learned a word without saying it. Dignity. It makes a town taller without moving it an inch. I hung my duster where the powder couldn't find it, laid out the button mic on May's counter like a broken tooth, and watched steam braid itself out of the kettle while Ranger chose a square of floor that let him see door and window at once. I'll tell you plain, for a place with an abandoned mine and a company with long pockets, that night held more peace than it had any business holding. The mountain kept her hour. The traveler and his dog kept theirs. Tomorrow held paper and names and maybe a man called Westray shaking dust off boots he kept too clean. If he came, he'd find we had a judge, a ridge that could speak for itself, and a town that had decided what kind of story it was willing to be in. Before sleep took hold, I wrote one line in my notebook so I wouldn't forget when papers started shouting. Fear is a cheap buyer. Wonder pays fair. The mirror trick tried to borrow our fear and charge interest. Tonight we paid with wonder by watching close, letting stone keep tempo, and trusting a dog to choose the right square. Ranger clicked his teeth and Room agreed to rest. Ranger woke before I did and watched the door like it had raised a question overnight. When he decided morning would not answer it polite, he touched my wrist with his nose and wagged once. That meant, get up, the day wants its chores. I was on my feet before the coffee even remembered what it was for. Outside May's porch, the air held a thin paper smell, like a copier had been set to humming where coyotes ought to be. Printer ink, fresh and cheap. The same shy thread we'd caught near the ridge. Sheriff Voss had the map spread across the hood of a cruiser, the way farmers read rain and lawyers read chance. Jimenez called, he said. Business parks west of Pinnacle, lots with new carpet and old excuses. One office looks temporary from the parking lot. Plants still tagged. Sign taped crooked. Valley View lighting. Laurel? I asked. On her way with a stack of rights taller than my patience? Ranger glanced uphill. I knew what that meant. We visit the office, but our bones belong to the ridge. Pinnacle's business park sits where a pasture gave up. Gravel pretends to be grass, and glass pretends to be sky. Valley View lighting had a lobby that smelled like solvent and rented chairs. The fern by the door still wore a nursery tag. A humming table, the kind that drinks paper and spits numbers, sat polite and guilty by a wall. Jimenez stood beside it with a look I trust, not impressed, not bored. Everett Thomas met us in a borrowed tie, trying to be an errand that learned to talk. Council advises cooperation, he said. You'll find invoices, permits, copies of copies, Laurel said, stepping through with cream dress and riding coat, both unafraid of carpet. Where's the original anything? E.T. gestured to a file cabinet with rails that squealed like a pig that didn't want to be there. Inside, forms with boxes kissed by the same pen, stamped by the same tired rubber, witnessed by names that didn't know our county roads. Ranger set his jaw on the drawer pull and held it while I flipped pages. His eyes said these papers smelled like hotel air and elevator breath. Jimenez pulled a tower from beneath a desk, a small server with a smug blue light. Logs, he said. Maybe schedules, maybe who signed the wire transfers. He looked to Voss. The sheriff nodded. Bag it. Chain of custody like you're marrying it. The printer wore a warm belly and a fresh cartridge. I opened the tray and found a test page that told on itself, laddered times, 02:59:50 through 03:01:00 in neat columns, and a note in the margin, stretch to 60s if crowd persists. Someone had written the note with a pen that likes money. Whose handwriting? Laurel asked E.T. Mine, he said, to his credit or his bad aim. Directive from Westray and Company. Expand demonstration if needed. He said demonstration like he was selling vacuum cleaners door to door in a county that sweeps with a broom and calls it good. Where's Mr. Westray? Voss asked. On his way, E.T. said. He likes to shake hands with problems. He glanced at Laurel's hand and thought better of extending his. We carried the tower, the printer memory, the fresh invoices, and a crate of mirror slivers out to the cruiser. Ranger looked past the park, nose turned to the ridge like a compass that ain't never been lost. On the drive back, Cloud stacked a weather sermon on the far line. Thunderhead's polite at first, then deciding to be honest. He'll try to move at 3, I said. Men who worship a clock can't keep from proving they own it. Then we invite him to his favorite church, Laurel answered, not smiling. Elias, I want the town there again. Fear hates an audience that knows where it's sitting. By noon, Mrs. Peake had pinned another note on the post. Closed until common sense returns. May swept her porch twice and laid out coffee like a bribe God would accept. Silas arrived with a cousin's cousin, Jess Westray, gray at the temples, hands that looked honest, eyes that wouldn't stay put. I signed some checks, he said, and then I saw the ridge breathe wrong and I quit. He handed Laurel a letter addressed to W in an envelope that smelled like cologne and money. Inside, a list, parcels, price floors, and a line about mood management that made the room colder. That line is a confession that wears shoes, Laurel said. Thank you, Mr. Westray. We will protect you as a witness. Jess looked like a man who had remembered what sleep feels like. At 1, a black SUV dusted the courthouse steps with City. The driver opened the door before the stop settled. The man who stepped out wore boots that had learned dust for the first time that morning. He had boardroom shoulders and a smile built of expensive practice. Westray, he said like he was introducing the weather to itself. He looked at Voss's badge, the tower in an evidence bag, Laurel's cream. He weighed me and measured Ranger, and then chose to ignore both. Mistake. Afternoon, Mr. Westray, Voss said. We'll be speaking in Judge Sims's room. I prefer negotiations to courtrooms, Westray said. Negotiations leave everyone the dignity of pretending they got what they wanted. Courtrooms leave you with paper, Laurel told him. Paper outlasts pretending. She walked, and the rest of us discovered we were following. In the courtroom, he tried charm and found it cost more than he had in his pocket. He admitted Valley View was a subsidiary, denied knowledge of any mirror trick, and tried to coach the word mapping until it turned into charity. Judge Sims listened until the watch in his vest told him patience owed him a leg back. "You will remove every instrument," the judge said, "and you will stand still while this county decides whether you deserve to work here again." Westray glanced toward E.T., who stared at the floor like it had just told him a secret about gravity. "If I comply," Westray said, "am I free to drive back to the city?" "You're free to wait," the judge said, "and we'll tell you when driving is a good idea." Lightning spoke once then. Far off, but definite. The court recessed. Outside, the air smelled like coins and rain. Westray checked his watch even when Sky was telling him what time it was. "3," he said softly, like an appointment he kept with himself. We set the board for the last play. Deputies at the ore mill and the ridge nest. Jimenez on the business park in case a second team tried to wake a spare choir. Silas near the question mark cedar. May at her mirror, red and ready. Mrs. Peak with a phone tree that can outrun boots. The preacher with a prayer short enough for men who work with their hands. Laurel at the adit. Voss where wires gather. Me and Ranger where the hum gets born. At 2:58, Thunder laid a palm on the ridge. At 2:59, the cut wire twitched like a roped calf thinking about a gate. 3 o'clock arrived with rain. The green tried to light and learned water makes honest liars. Mirrors blurred, powder ran. The hum found its mouth full of weather. I smiled, not mean, just relieved to see the mountain bring her own lawyer. Footsteps scrambled up trail. Slippery men wear slippery shoes. And I heard a city heel hit shale in a way that writes itself in a notebook. Ranger moved before my thought did. Arrow quiet, nose low. He followed the cinnamon cleaner, the hotel plant, the elevator breath, and then something newer. A bright wire smell, as if lightning had signed its name on a man's sleeve. We cornered Westray near the brace we knew, rain-writing stripes on his suit. He had a small pack slung over one shoulder and a coil in his hand, like a snake he intended to charm. "Sheriff," he said, "we're simply shutting down our equipment as ordered." "By walking into private ground in a storm with a pack full of timers?" Voss asked, stepping into his weather. "Drop it." He dropped it, slow enough to count as a conversation. The pack belched timer boxes and one thin ledger wrapped in plastic. Laurel lifted the ledger with 2 fingers like truth didn't need a grip. Inside, schedules, payouts, initials. The word Whitcomb typed under a column that expected a signature and never got one, and a line about mood management, their artful name for scaring a town into selling its own shadow. "You think we'll be ashamed to fight you?" Laurel said. "You misread the county." Lightning put its hand on the hill again, closer. A section of ribbing popped somewhere deeper. Just a warning knocked on wood. Ranger leaned into my leg and squared himself. That posture means, if this goes wrong, I will go first. We walked them out slow. Rain clarified the air. Voss had the deputies bring the SUV to the trailhead. Westray looked smaller when you measured him against weather and work. He tried one last purchase with a checkbook smile. "Ms. Whitcomb, reasonable people meet in the middle. I live there," she said. "But today the middle is here and the law is on my side." She didn't raise her voice. The storm did it for her. We locked the adit with county chain and her key. Voss read the rights like he was measuring boards. Westray listened like a man who believes no sentence could possibly be addressed to him unless it offered dessert. E.T. recognized the tone and let his shoulders sag. A man can get lighter putting down a lie even if it lands him in a cell. Back in town, we logged the pack, the ledger, the coil with moisture still on it, and the 3 timers that would have stretched tonight's ghost into an opera. Judge Sims signed more paper than a harvest needs and told the clerk to make copies until the truth got tired of seeing itself. Night came in clean behind the rain. The ridge exhaled a little steam like a horse that's run and won. May poured coffee for tired hands and not a soul argued about sugar. Silas sat with his cousin and didn't talk about powder or mirrors. Mrs. Peak told Ranger he'd done handsomer work than most men she knew and fed him the corner of a biscuit like a medal. I walked Laurel to her porch. She stood inside her own doorway and touched the frame like she was making a promise to a house as old as her blood. "Elias," she said, "tomorrow will be long. I'll carry one end," I said. "You already did." Her eyes softened a fraction. "And you, Ranger, you may guard my step any time the path looks wrong." He put his head under her palm, and the world did not argue. From the porch, I could see the mountain's black shoulder against a sky rubbed clean. No hum, no trick, just rock with rain on it and the kind of quiet that makes a man remember why he likes living where chores and dignity keep the same calendar. I scratched the notch in Ranger's ear. He leaned into the hand like a door leaning into a hinge done right. We slept in our boots because habit is a mule, and because sometimes a story saves its last page for when a man is relaxed enough to be surprised. Near midnight, a soft knock came that wasn't Knuckles. It was the kind of hush a man brings when he's ashamed to ask. Limp stood on May's step, hat in both hands, rain still finding him in all the places weather hides after a storm. He looked at Ranger first, the way some men ask a dog for permission to be sorry. "I set the mirrors," he said. "I told myself it was science. Tonight I heard church in the thunder and understood I'd been praying to a clock. I don't want that prayer anymore. There's no children in this story," I said. "There ain't," he answered, "which is why I'm here instead of home, lying to a face that would believe me." He put a small metal ring in my palm, keys, labeled with numbers we'd come to know. "That opens the lay-down yard and the trunk of the spare sedan by the mill. Maps, contracts, paper that can't look a neighbor in the eye." Voss took the ring without triumph. "You'll come in the morning and say this again, where ink can hear it." "I will." Limp looked past us up the ridge. "You reckon the mountain keeps a list? Who treated her decent? Who didn't?" "I think she keeps a list of who listened," Laurel said from the doorway. Her hair was down, a storm's gift. "Tonight, you listened." He nodded and went. Ranger followed him 3 steps, checked the man was walking toward daylight the long way round, then came back to my heel with that little breath he saves for endings that haven't quite admitted themselves. We slept at last, not deep, just enough to put the sharp edges under a blanket. Toward morning, copper gutters gave back their store, drip by patient drip. A clean smell rose from sage. Santer Hollow breathed like a barn with chores done. I thought of the first night, the blind water, the coins that wouldn't move, the wire dressed as witchlight, and felt a final tug from the ridge, like a horse nosing a pocket for one more sugar. "Tomorrow," I told the hill, "we finish it in daylight." The day had edges. We kept ours. Morning came without apology. The mountain showed herself clean after rain, dark shoulder shining like a worked horse that finally got watered. I brewed coffee on May's stove while Ranger watched both doors like he'd been hired. We had paper to carry, keys to turn, and a town that deserved to hear its own voice in daylight. For a traveler who mostly moves on, I felt the weight of staying like a good coat on a cold morning. Heavy, honest, exactly right. Sheriff Voss gathered us on the courthouse steps. Laurel in cream with her riding coat buttoned like law, May in red with a mirror in her pocket, just to remember how close a lie had walked, Silas with violet powder still living in the small rivers of his hands, and Mrs. Peake with an envelope full of times no one could argue with. E.T. came out of the jail looking smaller, the way men do when a room has taught them their scale. The limp man came by choice and signed his name in the book without flinching, like he had decided the truth could stand to see the sun. Judge Sims didn't waste our boots. He read the affidavits, sniffed the wire and the powder, tilted the mirror so it reflected nothing but ceiling, and pressed his seal into paper warm as bread. "Seizure stands, injunction stands, restitution likely," he said. "Return what isn't yours and pay the time it took you to pretend it was." He looked at Westray like a weather vane looks at wind, objective and sure of direction. "Sir, you can't rent fear and call it engineering." Westray tried to pour charm into the cracks and found they were already full of rock. "Santer Hollow will be compensated," he said, trying to speak over the shiver of his calendar. "We intended regional improvements, broadband, jobs, lighting the old haul roads for safety. You turned superstition into leverage, and our ridge into a rehearsal," Laurel answered. Jobs and broadband do not require mirrors that lie, nor wires dressed like witch lights, nor a hum that steals when folks are sleeping. Her voice was the kind that Cotton listens to, the kind that makes straight lines in the lint and tells Thread to behave. We walked the procession up to the laydown yard like a slow parade that had decided parades are work. Deputies opened the spare sedan's trunk with the keys the limp man handed over. Inside, rolled maps, a second ledger, and a hard hat with a printed sticker, Valley View Lighting Spectrum Team. The sticker peeled off in one ribbon, which told me about the adhesive and the plan both. May held the ribbon up like a fish she didn't intend to eat. "Souvenir," she said, "for the Remember When We Almost Lost Our Heads shelf." We took the maps to the school gym so the whole town could come look. Ranger walked the bleachers like he was elected to remind people where their feet were. The preacher stood on the lowest rung and explained the color bars for anyone who doesn't see charts for a living. "This is stress in rock, not sin in men," he said. But men made the picture and tried to sell it back to us as fate. Folks chuckled from a place close to anger, then let their shoulders fall. Laughter is a good hinge on a door that wasn't swinging right. E.T. admitted what he could admit without inventing poetry. He took instructions. He signed for parcels. He set nodes where a schedule told him. He watched the green and called it fluorescence because that word let him sleep. The limp man told how a mirror sliver can convince an honest miner that he's met a ghost if the hum is tuned close to teeth. Silas explained fluorite and tourist bracelets, and the part where a man scrapes by without lying, even if his hands wear violet for a season. It was a meeting without shouting. It was the sort that sends a rumor to live in the attic where it can't trip anybody. Then came the making right. Under order from Judge Sims, Valley View crews who suddenly remembered they were neighbors, not ghosts, cut their wires in daylight and carried every box and battery out through the 8-like sacks of last year's mistake. Voss read serials. Jimenez took photos. Mrs. Peak wrote times. Laurel ticked the ledger. I spoke into a tape in a flat voice that felt like sweeping while counting. Ranger watched the blind water earn its name again. Coins turned back into dark, which is the only honest color for that pool. When the last mirror sliver left the ridge, the green didn't so much go away as remember where it truly belongs, in veins and crystals that don't owe men a theater. The hum thinned to wind in a far seam. The brace we had swung that first night sat straight, and the chalk star beside the handbrake faded under finger rubs and time. We stood in that cleaned place and listened to what silence sounds like when it isn't hiding guilt. It sounded like a barn empty of worry and full of hay. Restitution came on paper and then in trucks, checks to folks who lost sleep, grants to mend the ore road for real, a fund for the volunteer fire crew to buy gear that doesn't apologize when the wind turns wrong. Laurel refused anything with her own name on it and sent the money to the school lab, where a science teacher already had a notion for using the seismograph to teach kids what the mountain says when no one is trying to make it lie. May donated her mirror to the library, where it went into a case labeled "Staring is Free, Believing Costs Extra." As for Westray, he learned that county jails have ceilings like any other room and that the idea of being too important for benches is a habit that doesn't survive hours. His lawyers mailed letters, Judge Sims mailed back law. The nice boots he'd worn to meet dust stayed under a chair like a dog that doesn't know what to do without a whistle. Everett Thomas asked for reading material, and we gave him the local weekly, and he read the editorial that said, "More or less, if you sell us light, make sure it doesn't come from stealing our dark." We didn't make him a villain in the paper. We named the works and the harm and the fix, and then we printed the parts that mattered more. What the quilting club did when the power blinked, how the mill hands rigged a safe walkway, how the preacher stood with the miners and they both laughed at the other's boot. Pride went around like a clean cup. Even folks who'd wanted to believe the ghost in green found they preferred the neighbor with the bolt cutters and the dog with the steady eyes. That night we ate under the cottonwoods by the river. May put her red scarf on a nail like a flag. Mrs. Peak brought chess pies. Silas contributed a box of bracelets that he promised were honest fluorite with no stories glued to them. The preacher blessed the ridge without borrowing God's vote. Voss leaned back on his elbows and did not write a single note, until the stars came on. Ranger moved table to table like he was taking statements in exchange for scratches. He likes the part of justice where grease and laughter meet. Laurel came late from a meeting with a man from the bank who finally understood the difference between progress and a loan shaped like a net. She looked tired in a way that makes men stand up. Her dress was still cream, dust had learned its manners around her. She smiled without theater and sat by the water with her boots off like a person who has decided not to be porcelain for 1 hour. "Neighbors," she said, not loud but far enough, "we kept our ridge without losing our manners. That will read better to grandchildren than any ghost." She lifted a cup of coffee to Ranger. He wagged once, then twice, which is a speech if you know him. Near the end of the meal, Limp stood and asked if there was work that paid in daylight and didn't require lying to rock. Laurel hired him to mend the service trail and watch for signs the mountain speaks in, cracks that learn new directions, roots that start to drift. She told him the job came with dignity and a notebook. He said he'd learn to spell dignity if she gave him time. "You earn it by showing up," she said. "The spelling can come later." Folks clapped the way they clap for a man who chose to change. Silas, who knows a vein by the way the air shifts a half-degree, signed on to lead what May named the Fires of Santer Walk, dusk tours up to the adit, where he would show plain minerals and tell true stories and end with the sign the Quilting Club painted. No whistling, no talk of luck, yes to listening. He practiced the route with Ranger as his first tourist. Ranger approved every stopping place with a sit that looked like a nod. Rest leaves room for memory. I walked the ridge with Laurel 2 days later so we could see how the mountain wore comfort. The nicked wire was gone, the little box's rectangle pressed out by boot soles and rain, and the blind water looked like a single thought again instead of a jar of coin. A hawk worked the thermals above the cedar that grows like a question mark. We stood by the brace we'd swung and made a pact without needing to say it. We would not let quiet become neglect. You can lose a place by ignoring it just as sure as by selling it. On the way down, we found, tucked in a crack, a note made of the cheap paper temporary office's love. No stamp, no address. Just a line. "We will return with partners." Typed neat and taped under a rock like a child hides a dare. Laurel read it and laughed once, not cruel. "When they come back, they'll find the green lives in a museum case and in the cliffs where it belongs," she said. "They will find a town that learned due diligence is a neighborly word." She folded the note into a smaller square and dropped it in a jar marked Lessons. Restitution checks arrived with signatures that tried to look humble. The bankman stopped pretending the word stakeholder means more than neighbor with a checkbook, and he drafted a thing called a conservation easement that made plain where trucks can't go and words can't cheat. Laurel read every line, fixed 3, added 2, and signed in an ink that doesn't fade. The county filed it in a drawer so ordinary you'd miss it if not for the little blue sticker that says, "Important, even if boring." That is a good place for power to live. Everett Thomas left after a month with a handshake that tried to mean he'd learned something. I hope he did. He sent a letter from a different company with a decent apology and enough specific nouns to make me believe lawyers hadn't ironed all the wrinkles out. He thanked Ranger by name for discouraging him at the right moments. Ranger had already forgotten him the way dogs mercifully do. As for Westray, his suits found softer rooms to talk in, and the part of him that hates dirt learned that sometimes a county's dirt is the only firm thing under a man's word. The court built orders the way good fences get built, straight, visible, not mean, and not afraid to be mended when weather works a corner loose. The fines went where harm had sat. The rest became a scholarship for kids who answer the mountain with math and not with lies. Laurel made sure the scholarship didn't require leaving the county to qualify. Not every good future needs a new city. I thought often of the first night. The window sheen on rock, the button mic asleep inside its tin, the mirror that turned one lantern into a ghost's shoulder. I thought about how cheap a piece of glass becomes once you call it by its name. But I also thought about what stayed mysterious even after the wires were gone. Some afternoons, when wind slides down the canyon just right, a single bar of green will breathe in a seam near the handbrake, the softest hint, there and gone, like a fish underwater remembering how to turn. The sign at the adit changed. Under no whistling and no talk of luck, the quilting club added a third line: no trespassing on your own sense. I don't know how to embroider that onto a habit yet, but I try. Ranger has it stitched into his bones. He never steps where he hasn't listened first. In town, life turned its wheels like a wagon you just greased. The mechanic fixed a rattle that had embarrassed third gear down Furnace Street for 6 months. The diner put trout on Friday if the river felt generous. Silas sold bracelets that came with a paper that told the truth. Fluorite, violet, found near Santer Hollow, polished by calloused hands, does not grant wishes, but it remembers light. May cleaned her mirror so it only showed faces again. Mrs. Peak wrote a column on how to seal an envelope so the glue doesn't fail in August. We are a practical people. We like our miracles to come with instructions. We kept walking the ridge. Ranger taught me new trails on purpose and a few by mistake. Mistake trails are the ones he forgets 2 days later and pretends were my idea. Laurel's boots learn to accept a little dust for the privilege of knowing exactly where she stands. She put a bench near the question mark cedar, facing the bowl of town. The plaque on it says simply, "Sit until you can hear." People read it and do so. You can tell because they get up slower and their faces have a little more room for weather. One evening in late fall, after the cottonwoods had let go their coins of yellow and the river had thinned to a silver rope, I took the bench alone while Ranger scouted the long way to see who had been on our hill. The sky had that brittle kind of blue that sounds like a bell if you breathe right. Down in the bowl, lights came on. Not the green kind, the supper kind. I could smell wood smoke and somebody's stew pretending it wasn't half onions. I closed my eyes to listen, and the mountain told the same story as always. I am old. Be kind. Do not hurry your judgment. Boots clicked on rock and Laurel sat without ceremony. We watched the town be itself a while. "You leaving?" she asked, "because folks who live honest don't pretend roads aren't real." "Not yet," I said. "A traveler keeps a bag half packed, but Ranger says the ridge has chores that fit our hands for one more season." Ranger returned then, stuck his head between us, and sighed the way dogs sigh when they approve of a plan that includes supper and honest work. She told me a thing then that made the air lean in. "I used to think being the last Whitcomb meant defending a name," she said. "Turns out it means tending a place and letting neighbors write their names on it too. It means knowing when a ledger is a hymn and when a hymn is a ledger. I thank you for reminding the mountain I was listening." "You were the one," she answered, I said. "I just carried a lamp and pointed at wires that didn't belong." We sat until first stars pushed at the lid of blue. Ranger pricked one ear at a coyote that had decided to think better of something down valley. A train took a long, low breath and set itself to counting miles. We walked back by porch light and were pestered into pie. You don't refuse pie in a county that can bake its way out of trouble. It's rude and it's foolish. Then winter ran its white comb through the ridge, and even the Adite wore a mustache of frost. Ranger broke trail like a plow with a wag at the back. We checked timbers. We checked the bench. We checked the question mark cedar's roots where rock pretends to be dirt until a storm asks it a hard question. We did the work you never see in a photograph, the kind that makes the photograph possible. The mind kept her mouth shut and her lungs doing what rock lungs do, resting heavy, breathing slow. Sometimes I swear I could hear a thin song far underfoot, the kind a barn sings when nobody's in it. Spring brought bluebirds to the seam where the mirror frame had once been braced, as if the mountain wanted to paint her own commas where we had set our period. The school lab wheeled the seismograph into a corner, and a kid with hands like he'd grow up to be Voss, or the mechanic read the wiggles and wrote a paper that said, "The hill sleeps, but it dream." He spelled all of it right. Laurel took cookies, and no one felt silly about that. By summer, we had a habit of meeting strangers who came because a cousin told them Santer Hollow smelled like decency. They'd stand at the adit and wait for something to happen, and we'd hand them the story instead. "The only thing you'll see is your own fear turning back into respect," May would say, and folks would nod like they'd come for just that and didn't know how to ask. One of those evenings, just as we were packing up a tour and Silas was pocketing the cash box with his new carefulness, a small breath of green bloomed deep in a hairline crack above the handbrake. No mirrors left, no powder, no clock. It rolled once like a trout's back and was gone. Nobody screamed. No one clapped. Ranger looked at it, then at me with the face that says, "We will not be foolish now." Laurel smiled slow, the rare kind, and tipped her hat to the rock as if to a friend who had told a joke we were old enough to get. I suppose I should finish the way the barkeep tells it when a fresh trucker stops for eggs and says he heard, "A traveler and his dog in an abandoned mine shocked the whole town." People laugh because they know the shock turned out to be ordinary and right-sized. Not ghosts, not gold, just neighbors remembering their posture and a ridge keeping her hour. But there was shocking in it, too. A company that thought paper could teach stone how to forget her rules. A county that learned to say no without raising its voice. And a dog who held his ground without pretending to be more than he is. As for me, I'll write it down until ink gets bored of my hand, and then I'll say it to any porch that wants a story to sit with. The part I keep for last is simple. On the first night, when the green breathed and the hum got into our bones, Ranger did not bark because he didn't need to. He has a way of trusting the work to find us if we do our walking in the right order. Listen, then step, step, then speak, speak, then stay to fix what got woke. We did that more or less. The mountain did her part. Santer Hollow did its part. We found a hinge and leaned the door the right way. We hung a final little sign by the brace where the fox path begins. It says, in letters May painted between lunch rush and sundown, "Traveler, mind your dog. Dog, mind your nose. Neighbor, mind your hour." We figured that covered the important parts without scaring the timid or daring the foolish, and it fits tidy on one board. Ranger likes to sit by it like he's volunteering to be proof the middle line is not a joke. He looks good there. He looks like a thing a town can trust, even when math and thunder conspire. On the last night of the season, the town ate by the river again. The moon put flour on everything and made even the old ore mill look like a cake you could cut if you dared. Laurel read a thank you that had more commas than a courtroom, but never felt long. Voss kept his words in his pocket where they belonged, and only brought out the ones that had earned the air. Silas told a joke that made the preacher pretend not to laugh. Mrs. Peak led a toast with lemonade and made it feel like church. Ranger stole a crust and paid for it by posing for 3 photographs he didn't ask to be in. When folks drifted, and the lamps were jars of fire, and the river had said goodnight 3 times, I walked to the bench above the cedar and looked at the attic door. It held still, a dark mouth with polite teeth. I thought about leaving, the way I always do when a job stops being a job and starts being a life, and my feet did not move. Ranger came and leaned his shoulder into my calf, and I took that for a vote. A wind moved through sage like a big hand smoothing a good tablecloth. Somewhere deep under timber and old law, maybe the mountain smiled. We watched the ridge. Amen.